Should I start out?
Good
evening to everyone. I'm Jerry Tracy, Executive Director of Historic Fort Worth, and we are delighted you are here this evening for our 18th Samuel Benton Cantey lecture and our very first virtual event. So we're thrilled that you're joining us, and the only safe way to do it at this point in time. So who was Samuel Benton Cantey III? He was a businessman, an art collector, a leader of the Fort Worth Art Association, now known as the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth, and a visionary who understood great buildings as irreplaceable masterpieces in a citywide art museum. When architecturally significant buildings were being demolished in the name of progress, Sam Cantey commissioned Fort Worth Circle artist Bror Utter to paint them. Today, these paintings are part of a rich collection of Fort Worth Circle paintings held at the Amon Carter Museum of American Art. Although Mr. Cantey died in 1973, he left us with a son, Samuel Benton Cantey IV, and a grandson, the fifth. So I hope they're watching. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Catherine Holliday, Kate, as we know her here. She is the chairman of Historic Fort Worth's Education Committee. She is responsible for connecting all of us to Willis Winters and his research on Dilbeck designed houses in Fort Worth and beyond. Dr. Holliday is an architectural historian at UTA whose research and teaching focus on the built environment in American cities. She brings an interdisciplinary approach to the classroom and to her writing, which is also what she brings here to Historic Fort Worth. In 2019, Dr. Holliday authored a book on the collection of works by the late architecture critic, David Dillon, whose commentary received awards from the Associated Press, the Dallas Press Club, and the Texas Society of Architects. Dillon's essays delve into issues of downtown redevelopment, urban sprawl, planning, and historic preservation in Texas cities. The book is titled The Open-Ended City, David Dillon on Texas Architecture. There is no doubt that Samuel Benton Cantey III, Kate Holliday, and Willis Winters are cut from the same mold. So it's my pleasure to have Kate take over.
Great, thank you for that introduction, Jerry. I really appreciate it. Again, I'm Kate Holliday. I'm an architectural historian. I'm director of the David Dillon Center for Texas Architecture at the University of Texas at Arlington. And it's really a privilege to be able to work with everyone at Historic Fort Worth on issues that are important to our local community, right? Because as an academic and historian, you know, the rubber meets the road in your hometown, right? And so anything that I can do to be engaged and active here in Fort Worth and in Dallas is incredibly important to me. I'm really excited to be able to help to provide this year's Cantey lecture online instead of in person. As we all know, we've been doing a lot of stuff online. And I want to say that this is Historic Fort Worth's first venture into the online world. And so wish us luck. Everybody keep their fingers crossed it goes smoothly. Any technical problems, just blame me, right? So we'll work it out. I also want to say that for anyone who is wondering what Historic Fort Worth does, and maybe this is your first time engaging with Historic Fort Worth, I just want to really reinforce the role that Jerry and the entire board and the organization plays in historic preservation in the city. Historic Fort Worth maintains two amazing historic houses. They maintain a resource center that has an incredible collection of photographs and documentation about the history of the city, architecture, and its neighborhoods. They're incredible advocates at every landmarks meeting and with the endangered list that comes out every year. I mean, it's an organization that really plays an important role in the city and in shaping conversations about what makes this place special. And so it's really an honor to be able to work with them. I also really want to thank a few people for helping me kind of put the pieces together surrounding how to put this event online. Of course, want to thank Jerry Tracy and John Roberts from Historic Fort Worth. I want to thank Britt Stokes from Acme Brick, who's also on the education committee and really helps get the word out about this event. I want to thank Marie Ellerking, who's a former student at UTA and who's now a fantastic historic preservation architect herself. She worked at THC and is now at Komatsu Architecture in Fort Worth. Thank you, Marie. As well as Ethan Wu, who's a graduate student in architecture at UCA right now, who's kind of helping man the controls here and who helps with a lot of the production for this event. So thank you, Ethan. And a lot of that is the kind of behind the scenes stuff, right? That a simple event like this takes a lot of people and a lot of time and effort. And so thank you all for joining us. With that, I see we're up over 100 participants, which is good news for me. And I'll stop talking now, well, as people have kind of logged on, and I can introduce our speaker, who's very patiently waiting here, who is really the main event. And Willis Winters is joining us tonight. He's a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. He's a writer, he's an architect, he's a preservation advocate. He's won just about every award you can possibly think of for his work as an architect and an advocate for architecture in Dallas and in Texas. And he worked for many years in the Dallas Park Department, over 20 years, spending more than 10 years as the director of the Dallas Park Department before retiring just earlier this year. He is a passionate advocate, especially for Fair Park, and planning for its care and its maintenance across the long term and its survival into the future. And he also created this really wonderful program for the Dallas Park Department, the Park Pavilion program, that provided these jewel-like, exceptionally beautiful pavilions and parks all across the city, designed by some really talented designers. And these things are worth their own road trip, just a really incredible thing to have done for the city of Dallas. Willis is also an author. He has published books on Fair Park, on the park cities in Dallas. He contributed to the Buildings of Texas series, and he is now at work on another book on Charles Stevens Dilbeck, and he's going to share some of that work and research with us this evening. Before I turn it over to the lecture that we've pre-recorded, I want to say, be sure to stick around through the entire pre-recorded lecture. Willis will be here at the end for a live Q&A. For those of you who are already familiar with this kind of context, you know that in this webinar format, there's a Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen. If you hover over it with your mouse, you can type in your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll field those questions live with Willis at the end of the lecture. So be sure to hang around for that live discussion, as well as some closing remarks from Jerry Tracy. With that, we're going to try to turn it over to our pre-recorded lecture. Give me a moment to try to get it set up, and hopefully things will go smoothly, and we'll see you back here in about 40-45 minutes at the end of the lecture. Okay, good to see everyone.
I appreciate the opportunity to present the Samuel Benton Cantey, the third lecture, sponsored by Historic Fort Worth. Tonight I'll be talking about the work of Charles Stevens Dilbeck, architect in Fort Worth. A little bit on Dilbeck's life and career before I get into his work. He was born in 1907 in Fort Smith, Arkansas. His family moved to Tulsa when he was 8 years of age in 1915. His father owned a planing mill in Fort Smith, which burned to the ground in a tragic fire. Decided to look for other opportunities in a bigger city, so they moved to Tulsa. By 1918, when Dilbeck was 11 years old, he began designing buildings for his father, who had become a Tulsa contractor, mainly doing apartment buildings and small churches. In 1923, he began working for the first of several lumber companies as an in-house draftsman, modifying stock house plans. So as clients would come in and buy a house plan and probably the lumber, Dilbeck would modify the plans. And then later, as he grew in competence and experience, began to design houses and making more significant changes. In 1925, when he was a senior in high school, he began work for a Tulsa architect named John Duncan Forsyth on the Marlin Mansion in Ponca City, Oklahoma. He was 18 years of age. Marlin was the founder of Marlin Oil, which later became Conoco Oil, and commissioned Forsyth to design the most expensive house ever built in the state of Oklahoma up to that time. Dilbeck was Forsyth's on-site construction superintendent for 3 years, 1925 to 1928. And in 28, when he finished the Ponca City project, he established his own architectural practice in Tulsa. In 1932, this was 3 years after Black Friday, he decided to close his business in Tulsa and moved to Dallas when he was 25 years of age to seek a new fortune and new life. He established a brief 6-month partnership with a Dallas architect who did major residences there named George Marble. And then in 33, he left his partnership with Marble and set up his own solo practice in Dallas with an office in the Highland Park Village Shopping Center. And then fast forwarding to 1990, that was the year of Dilbeck's death. Following his retirement in 1970, he was 83 years old when he passed away. This is a list of projects that Dilbeck designed in Fort Worth. He did more projects in Fort Worth than any other city besides Tulsa and Dallas. Beginning with in 1936, when he was 29 years of age, he did the house for Julian and Edna Meeker. And in his experience in Fort Worth went through 1959. His last project was the Polynesian Village at the Western Hills Hotel. I think he did 6 or 7 houses in Fort Worth, a house in Westlake. I'm also going to show you an apartment complex in Fort Worth and a guest ranch in nearby Mineral Wells to the west. Some images now from his work before he moved to Dallas. This is the Marlin Mansion that I mentioned in Ponca City that Dilbeck was the construction and site superintendent from 1925 to 1928 for John Duncan Forsyth. A house, one of Dilbeck's earliest houses in Tulsa, 1927. This was what is called the house under the tent in his oral history interviews. It was designed probably as part of a newspaper competition and was, Dilbeck had the idea of building it under a circus or a tabernacle tent so that no one could see it until it was unveiled upon completion. Another French Norman house in Tulsa from 1928. Here you can see the round turreted entry hall, the half timbering, very graphic pattern across the facade, and a prominent masonry chimney. And a very unique house in Tulsa, one of the last that Dilbeck completed before he moved to Dallas. This one was started in 32, finished the following year. You can see the sort of massing and forms of the house, the window patterning, the masonry texture, the cupola on the form on the left, and the dormer windows, all very interesting architectural character on this house. In 1932, Dilbeck decided he'd had enough in Tulsa business. There was no business for architects, and he closed his shop, packed his furniture, and moved to Dallas. A few houses in Dallas and the Park Cities that I wanted to show you to see, so you can see what he was working on before he began working in Fort Worth in 1936. This is a house for Messerol Brothers. This was a speculative house in University Park, ranch style. I want you to notice the sort of rough cream-colored field stone walls trimmed and outlined in orange, probably Palmer brick, and in the balcony with the brackets, the cedar pole brackets that are shown over here on the left. A duplex in University Park on University, built in 1937. A very beautiful composition, nice patterns on the balcony rails. Here's a small window with smaller brackets that you can see here. Dilbeck, as far as I can determine, owned one architecture book. This was, it was called La Normandie. It was a folio of about 200 prints that were contained in the folio. And I'm going to show you how he used this book throughout his career. This is a plate from La Normandie showing a very strange exterior covered staircase. And here is a house in Dallas completed in 1937 with that same almost identical staircase applied to the side at the end of this house. This is the Marshall Cloyd residence. We'll see this again. There's the larger residence with the stair just showing on the right there behind the trees. I'll come back to this house later in the presentation. A house in Wichita Falls for Dr. Walter Adams, ranch house showing this Monterey balcony with a diagonal pattern on the railing, and again the same cedar pole brackets that you see here. We'll see that on other houses. This sort of grill work on the second floor, usually at a restroom or toilet space, and in this low wall, masonry wall that extends out into the landscape, terminated by a round masonry column. Dilbeck also developed what are called tourist courts or tourist lodges, an early form of the motor court or motel. This was the El Rancho Hotel in Dallas, completed in 1942. He also did a lot of restaurants in Dallas and other places, including Red Bryan Smokehouse, which was completed in 1946. And I want to point out here this beautiful cylindrical, almost a beehive-shaped chimney flue that became a Dilbeck signature on many of his houses. Now we're going to get into his work in Fort Worth. And so this section is entitled The Sensational Work of Charles Stevens Dilbeck in Fort Worth, Texas. And we'll start, these projects are all in chronological order. We're going to start with his first house, commissioned from Julian and Edna Meeker in 1936. It was completed in 1937. This house is in a mobile home community in Northwest Fort Worth on Sleepy Hollow Drive. Meeker moved to Fort Worth in 1923. He entered the oil business here as an independent operator in 1924. He was active civically. He organized the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce and served as president of the Fort Worth Opera Association. And he owned this farm in the rich Trinity Bottoms of Northwest Fort Worth, where he farmed, hunted, and fished. Here's a photograph of Meeker on the right side, standing to the left of Amon Carter at the Fort Worth Centennial Celebration in 1949. In an oral history, Charles Dilbeck said that Meeker had met Phyllis Wiggins and had seen his house in Dallas, which was also designed by Dilbeck, and it was built by a Fort Worth general contractor named Byrne and Luther. He wanted Dilbeck to be the architect of his proposed residence in Fort Worth. The site was located on an old Indian campground, which featured natural springs and large live oak trees. This is a plan of the Meeker house showing the large living room, a living porch, which was sort of a term that Dilbeck invented for his outdoor spaces, a screened-in porch on the back side of the house, a library den, and then this passageway here, or porte cochere, which separated the main house from the garage and the maid's quarters. This house was over 300 feet long. Here's the front side of the house. Again, this serves as the community center for this mobile home community. So the front yard is now paved, but they've taken very good care of the house, and it's in really, really good condition. Image of the front entrance to the house through this rounded arched opening that you see here. And in the Julian Meeker's bathroom and dressing room are in this space, which sort of cantilevers out from the house, but again, is supported by the lodge poles that you see there, and we've seen on several other houses. So now I want to focus on this rounded arched opening that Dilbeck employed here at the entrance to the Meeker house. Here's the origin, a plate number 25 from La Normandie, this French sort of castle, French Norman castle. a house in Dallas, which has a very similar entrance arch at the front door, which you see here, and an arched entry at the house, the Adams residence in Wichita Falls from 1940. This passageway with a dovecote, a functioning dovecote cupola on top of the porte cochere. The rear side of the Meeker residence, there are references in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram of Paul Whiteman and members of his All-American Band feasting on barbecue at the Meeker House on White Settlement Road. So if you can imagine on a day after a performance in Fort Worth at the Fort Worth Exposition and Livestock Exposition and Fat Stock Show, the band would come out to the Meeker residence for a Sunday afternoon barbecue on this very lawn. Whiteman was known as the king of jazz during the 1920s and early 1930s, and he was America's most popular band director during this era. A slight divergence here from architecture, but Whiteman was brought to Fort Worth in 1936 by Billy Rose to appear in the Casa Manana show at the Fort Worth Frontier Centennial. He bought a riding horse from Julian Meeker and became close friends of the Meeker family, I guess through these barbecues and parties at the Meeker house. During his performance at the Frontier Centennial, he admired Meeker's home and actually announced that he would retire and build a new house in Fort Worth, and he wanted Charles Dilbeck as his architect. Whiteman asked Dilbeck to start designing a house on Eagle Mountain Lake, and he wanted to send Dilbeck together with his wife, Margaret Livingston, on a trip to Mexico to select materials and furnishings for the house. However, during the run of the Casa Manana show, Whiteman received a radio contract from New York and went back to that city following the Frontier Centennial, so the house was never built. However, Dilbeck was Whiteman's guest at the opening night of Billy Rose's spectacular show, shown here in this photograph, in the 4,000-seat open-air amphitheater at the Casa Manana. He sat next to Billy Rose's wife, Fanny Brice, and across the table from Amon Carter and from Billy Rose himself. And if this is indeed a photograph from the opening night, I think I have spotted Dilbeck down here, front stage center, in this white jacket, slightly balding. You can see he's taller than anyone else around him. I believe that Billy Rose, who is 5'1", is sitting right here across the table. And that looks like it's probably Fanny Brice sitting in front of Dilbeck. So really fascinating photograph from the UTA Library's collection. Some upstairs rooms at the Meeker residence, the main stair hall. You can get the character of Dilbeck's beautiful architecture and this barrel vaulted white painted corridor upstairs, which led to the master suite. And this would be the exterior, the sleeping room off of the master suite, supported by these two round masonry columns, which would have been defining the living porch underneath. The next house is a residence for I.C. and Jewel Parker on Simondale Drive, completed in 1937. Parker began working for Pangburn Ice Cream and Candy Company in 1926 and became the company's president later in 1943. He retired in 1970 and remained chairman of the board until his death in 1976. Here's Parker, a photograph of Parker, 1945, second from the left, at a national sales convention for Pangburn in Fort Worth. His wife, Jewel Parker, was a talented commercial artist who created the pinups, cowgirls that became the symbol for Pangburn Western style chocolates. You can see here. She also was responsible for the artwork for Billy Rose's theatrical extravaganza at the Fort Worth Frontier Centennial in '36. The plans for the house, this is the Parker House on Simondale now. You can see this is what I would call a turreted French with a large round stair tower and a Juliet balcony here on the side of the tower. Heavy shingle roofs. Here are the low masonry walls that extend out into the front yard, terminated in square columns here, not round columns like we saw at the house in Wichita Falls. The plans for this house were reversed blueprints of a house designed by Dilbeck in 1934 for Messerol Brothers in University Park. So here is the identical house to the Parker house, only a reverse blueprint. And Dilbeck must have sold the plans to either the Parkers or their contractor for their house. Back to the Parker house. Dilbeck designed very similar French Norman houses to the Parker house with the large round stair tower and or turret in both Sherman and Waxahachie. We're standing here at the I.C. Parker house in Fort Worth on Simondale. He moved to Dallas. He began to put these large turrets that served as stair halls on his some of his signature French Norman or residences and houses. This was probably the second or third of his career here at the Parker house. Here's a close-up of the stair tower with showing the Juliet balcony that actually was not accessible from inside. Suspended out, cantilevered out, but also with these diagonal cedar brackets that you see here. And the end elevation of the Parker house, which is not visible from Simondale because of the hedgerow. Here is a similar house in Sherman with almost the identical end elevation. The entry hall at the Parker house, looking down towards the stair hall, the front door on the right. Dilbeck's front doors were typically 4 feet wide and almost always a Dutch door. We'll see another one coming up in a moment at the Griffith house. Going back now towards the stair tower itself, which is this beautiful spiral staircase with what I would call stacked planks of wood, one on top of the other, curving around. I'm in the inside of the turret. This is a stair hall for the Parker house. Beautiful spiral wooden staircase inside the circular walls on the exterior. The wood treads are solid pieces of wood, the tread and the risers, which show their end grain at the center of the hall. Also, Dilbeck designed a balcony window with functioning French doors here with a false balcony outside. So when you look outside back towards the house, it looks like it's a functional balcony that you could walk out onto. But as you can see here, it's at the midpoint of the stair risers and doesn't function as a balcony, but beautiful from the inside. The nice textured walls and plaster, which is actually found throughout the house, and then a beautiful cast iron or metal handrail, hand forged, and beautiful light fixtures and pendants also are found throughout the house and are all probably original items. And Dilbeck liked to use, in particular, a metal studio in Dallas called Potter Metal Studio to do all of his light fixtures and metalwork in his premier houses. Looking into the living room towards this beautiful fireplace, which was another Dilbeck signature element. There's a close-up of the fireplace showing the masonry or the brick units that have been honed and polished to look like cobblestones. Here above the fireplace on all the surfaces and the walls and the various tiers. And then also Dilbeck liked to use on the interior of his houses, but also sometimes for exterior doors, this cypress that is called, as you see here on the mantelpiece, is called Pecky cypress. We'll see that again on almost all the interior doors throughout the house. Very rich, beautiful pattern surface that you see here. Pecky cypress is shown here again in the dining room on the doors. It is basically a worm-eaten cypress that gives these incredible, beautiful results on interior woodwork. In the dining room here in the Parker House, Dilbeck employed what I would call a typical pattern on his dining room ceilings, which it consisted of dividing the room into 4 squares with sort of this basic, the flat wooden framework that you see in the ceiling, and then filling it with, again, Pecky, cypress, flat panels or planks on this diagonal pattern that you see here. On the back terrace of the Parker House is a covered porch, which is defined by another Dilbeck signature design element, round masonry columns. It's one of the things that I look for on Dilbeck houses that would indicate to me, if we didn't have the drawings, that it was for sure a Dilbeck design. The next house is for Wren and Billy Clark on Crestwood Drive, 307, completed in 1940. Wren Clark was a vice president for the Double Seal Ring Company of Fort Worth, who manufactured piston rings. He would later be a partner in the Western Hills Hotel. His wife, Billy, was best friends with Edna Meeker. The Meekers would build their second house next door to the Clarks at 309 Crestwood in 1953. Billy was also involved in the early years of the Jewel Charity Ball, which was founded in 1953. Wren was on the board of Casa Manana Theater. Stars like Phyllis Diller and many others that performed at Casa Manana partied at the Clark house, at this house, after the show on opening night. Wren was also an accomplished amateur magician, and had Dilbeck design the house with a library at the end of the living room that also functioned as a raised stage. So this is the living room in the center of the house. This is the library, sort of a half of an octagon form, and you can see that it's on axis with the living room. The dining room was 3 steps up from the living room, so acting as sort of a balcony. Here's the entrance hall, the kitchen, which will come into my discussion later. I want to point out the location of this kitchen window, which was adjacent to the Meeker house that would be built in 1953. A view of the living room, looking from the library back towards the entrance hall and the raised dining area. Beautiful doors with these horizontal thin wood mullions and horizontal glass panes. Now looking back towards the library, which was basically Wren Clark's magic stage. And there's this beautiful chimney, beautiful interior fireplace that sort of consumes an entire length of the living room. This is what I would call a beehive fireplace, also built with masonry units that are sort of been polished and crafted to look like cobbles. Look at all the little doors and niches and platforms and surfaces that make this such a picturesque composition. Now back to the library, which double functioned as the stage in Wren Clark's magic shows. Clark commissioned Dilbeck to design an addition to his house in 1950, shown here in this plan, about the same time that Dilbeck was designing an expansion also for Clark of the Western Hills Hotel. The addition in Dilbeck's oral history interview is described as a Polynesian lounge room with waterfalls here in this section, bamboo ceiling beams, a bird aviary around the perimeter, glass walls looking out into the dense foliage and the trees behind the house. Here's the exterior view of that 1950 addition, and a photograph of the mural, this sort of Asian-influenced Japanese mural that was behind the waterfall on that curving wall. The Russell and Myrtle Griffith residence is located on West Ridge Avenue. It was completed in 1942. Griffith worked as a salesman for Stafford Loudon Company, a lithoplate engraving firm in Fort Worth. Dilbeck designed a French Norman house with an octagonal tower shown here in the center, and the stair hall here in the plan. I also want to point out another living porch, this one coming off at an angle, similar to the Meeker house that may have been screened in originally. And the stair tower shown here at the bottom, and here's a blow up of it, of the elevation of the Griffith house. Very similar to the octagonal stair tower on the Marshall Cloyd residence in Dallas from 1937, shown here. Another house, and back to the Griffith house, showing the prominence of the stair tower, the living porch extending out into the landscape with this false dovecote put into the top of the gable wall. The living porch would have been opened air originally and was enclosed by a later owner. Looking down the front facade of the house towards the stair tower, the front door, again, 4 foot wide with a Dutch door. And the interior entry hall, looking through the house along the length of the hall towards the living porch, dining room on the right, and the stair made of these wooden stacked planks on the left. There's a smaller stair hall than at the Parker House on Simondale. Beautiful living room, beamed ceiling, leaded glass windows. Here's the detail of the fireplace, very similar to what we've seen with the beautiful ledges, asymmetrical doors that probably were to store the fire you see in various locations, and the swing arm so that you could cook your chili directly over the fire. The dining room showcases the original design of the wood ceiling in these panels defined by the beams, possibly Pecky cypress on that, leaded glass windows with stained glass patterns, typical on Dilbeck's larger houses. A photograph of Dilbeck from 1941 when this house was, the Griffith house was completed, and also as he was starting work on the design of the next house for Edward and Clara Dealey in Westlake, Texas, which was completed in 1942. This house was one of Dilbeck's largest ranch houses, built on a 220-acre ranch for the president of Belo Corporation and the publisher of the Dallas Morning News, Ted Dealey. You can see this wild, meandering floor plan that extends out into the landscape. It probably has 8 or 9 different angle changes, and it was definitely Dilbeck's ranch masterpiece. Fidelity Investments bought the property from the current owners in 1998. Scott and Kelly Bradley moved the house to a new site several miles away and had it updated and restored in 2008. And it was recognized the following year, 2009, by Historic Fort Worth with a Residential Rehabilitation Award. This is the reassembled and restored house on its new site in front of a pond. Beautiful chimneys, ranch style round columns. Here's the low masonry wall in the landscape, terminating in a small round column. Look at the detail on this fireplace, another one over here, and another screened in porch that we've seen on Dilbeck's work throughout the presentation. The living room featured an equally astonishing interior fireplace on this wood wall that extends the entire length of the room. The next house was completed in 1948. It was a builder or speculative residence for a Fort Worth contractor named William Schenkel, located on Mount Royal Terrace. It had an open house. This is an actual article from the Southwestern Home Builder that shows the house on Mount Royal Terrace. It had an open house in 1939. So it was built by Schenkel and then turned over to a Fort Worth realtor to sell. And here's a description of the house. It was described as French provincial, although I think I might describe it as ranch. And it was designed, quote, by the famous architect Dilbeck, unquote. And the price of this house, the asking price was $57,000 in 1939. That would be roughly $625,000 today. The first owner who bought this house was the Fort Worth auto dealer named Thomas Abbott. And it has been significantly altered, especially with the Spanish tile roof, but the basic form of the house is there and visible from the street today. The next project, completed a couple of years later, was the Meadow Apartments on Birchman and Pershing Avenue. There were 56 apartments in 7 buildings. And this complex was located in Arlington Heights, and it provided critical post-war housing in Fort Worth. The owners were Ren Clark and 2 of his partners from the Double Ring Seal Company, Hank Green and Earl Moore, who would also be his partners at later at the Western Hills Hotel. Moore also was the contractor of this project. You can see some similarities that we've already seen with especially the Meeker residence, this sort of cantilevered Monterey style balcony with a distinctive diamond shape rail pattern or that extended full height here on the left, supported underneath by these diagonal cedar logs or brackets. Very similar to the Meeker house, and also very similar to an apartment building that Dilbeck designed in Dallas from about the same time. You can see the similarities between these 2 projects. The next project is the Saybold Guest Ranch, or El Vaquero as it was termed, completed in 1948, about 4 miles west of Mineral Wells, overlooking the Brazos River. The owners were Elmer and Dorothy Saybold. He was a renowned farrier, which is basically a blacksmith for horses, and he raised Palomino horses on this ranch. You can see the horse barn over here in the upper left. The main guest ranch is this donut-shaped piece with an open courtyard, a large swimming pool in the center. Almost looks like a Texas frontier fort with this raised section over the entrance where the cavalry would enter the courtyard. Saybold played on the offensive line for TCU Horned Frogs and also played on the TCU baseball team during the 1930s. The ranch has been through several owners since Saybold died in 1996. Each of the subsequent owners have determined that Dilbeck was the architect, although to date I've not found the documentation for that, but I believe it feels like a Dilbeck project, and I feel strongly that that he had a hand in it. New owners recently have completed a substantial renovation of the Saybold Ranch and have reopened the facility under the new name, the Rest Yourself River Ranch. And this is a photograph of the courtyard at the recent open house. Beautiful interior space. Saybold never publicly credited Dilbeck as the architect, and he says that he built the ranch by hand. But there are clues that Dilbeck's clues located throughout the project. John Wayne allegedly had a room at the back corner of this complex with an exterior door where he could enter directly from the outside without being seen from this interior courtyard. The Western Hills Hotel was one of Dilbeck's largest and most expensive projects for certain. It was undertaken in 1950, completed in 1951. He had prior hotel and tourist lodge experience. I've already shown you the Ranch Hotel in Dallas on Harry Hines Boulevard, completed in 1942. Prior to that, he did the El Rancho hotel in Gallup, New Mexico, completed in 1938, shown in this postcard view. And he did the Belmont Hotel in Dallas, completed in 1947. The Western Hills was located on a 15-acre site with a building that stretched roughly 500 feet along Camp Bowie Boulevard. In this Dilbeck rendering, you can see the three wings of rooms that extended out behind the hotel. The two on the east and the central wing enclosed a courtyard, a pool courtyard that was also formed in with a semicircular cabana. There were also cottages around the perimeter of the complex, and even possibly a Dilbeck designed gas station here at this front corner. There were 5 general partners in the hotel that included Hank Green, who was the president and managing director. He lived at 401 Crestwood. Earl Moore was the vice president and general contractor of the project. He also built the Meadow apartments designed by Dilbeck. He lived at 305 Crestwood. And then Ren Clark, who was also a vice president, he lived at 307 Crestwood. So you can see there's a strong Crestwood connection here. And 4 of the 5 partners were also the executives at the Double Seal Ring Company. The hotel had 200 rooms originally, 14 deluxe guest suites, and 15 cabanas in this semicircular form here. The room rates were $5.39 for a single room, $7.39 for a double room. The color shot of the pool courtyard and cabanas. Ground level view of the front of the hotel facing Camp Bowie. And a photograph, a floor plan here that shows the main entrance lobby, the reception desk, the 3 wings, room wings, the pool, the key club, and the restaurant here that we'll see some photographs of coming up. Next, here's the lobby. The furnishings were provided by Leonard's Department Store. A color version with the models all carefully placed for the picture. And then there were 3 dining rooms. This was the branding room with murals here on the sidewall by the Fort Worth artist Emily Guthrie Smith. The sirloin room and the high frontier room. So guests would come into this space, make a selection of their steak displayed here in this ice dome, and then they would brand their steak how they wanted it cooked, rare or medium well, with the cattle brands here to the left. There is also a members only cocktail lounge called the Key Club. An article in Time magazine described the Western Hills as a dazzling example of the vast change which has taken place in the hotel business. And if you were a good angel in the mid-1950s, you got to go to the Western Hills Hotel as advertised in this ashtray souvenir. Dilbeck, after the Western Hills, did another large hotel project for the New Mexico Teachers Union in Albuquerque called the Western Skies. It was undertaken in '54, completed in 1959. The final residence we're going to look at tonight is the Julian and Edna Meeker residence, their second residence. This one built also on Crestwood Drive. So I've talked about all the partners, Ren Clark's partners that had houses on Crestwood. Here's another Crestwood connection with the Meeker residence. I mentioned that Edna Meeker and Billy Clark were best friends. Dilbeck designed this house so that the Edna's window was directly opposite Billy's window in the Ren Clark house next door. I showed you that on the floor plan earlier. They also shared a common outdoor laundry line. This shows the plan of the Meeker house, the central living room, which Dilbeck labels a lounge room, an open air carport, an outdoor kitchen that we'll see a photograph of, down here. Here's a front elevation showing the carport on the left, the front door, and the topography of the site. Exterior view and the little entrance plaza at the front door, a Roman brick and masonry on the house, and the view with Edna Meeker standing at her outdoor ovens in the living porch area. The final project is the Western Hills expansion and Wren Clark's Polynesian Village, completed in 1960. So this was an expansion of the Western Hills Hotel. In 1959, on the 8th anniversary of the hotel's opening, Wren Clark bought out his 4 partners, purchasing the hotel for $2.5 million. He commissioned Dilbeck to design a 50-room addition, an expansion of the hotel's banquet and convention facilities, and a new restaurant and bar complex called, as shown in this ad, Wren Clark's Polynesian Village. This also shows sort of the renovated facade of the hotel facing the pool and the cabana area. Some more advertising talking about the 3 beautiful dining rooms and cocktail lounge, the Hawaiian room, the Tahitian room, and the cannibal room, which was the bar area. The Polynesian Village was managed by Nick Noyes, the owner of the Mauna Loa Polynesian restaurant in Mexico City. It had tape-recorded thunder, mechanical lightning, and man-made tropical rain showers that were staged once an hour for the diners. So here's a view looking into the Samoan hut and down the Hawaiian room. The Fort Worth Star-Telegram proclaimed, the simple truth of the matter is that there's nothing like it, nothing so elaborate, nothing so exquisitely nursed to life in this section of the country. The new Key Club, which is shown in this floor plan in the pink area here, the gray area is the original members-only Key Club. This is the new expanded Key Club. Was called the Sunken Galleon. That was designed as the interior of an ancient Spanish galleon where guests entered through an old diving bell, which is this round form here in the corner of the room. So you would come in from the corridor, enter the diving bell, the door would close, and then there would be a simulated descent to the ocean floor through bubble sounds, recordings, and video shown in the various windows and portals of the diving bell. When you reached the floor, the door would open and you would enter then into the sunken ship on the floor of the ocean. And I'll show you a photograph of that. The Polynesian Village, this in the green area, shows the various rooms, the Tahitian room, the Samoan room, the cannibal room, cocktail lounge, and then a convention facility with 300 seats in this banquet area. Here's the cannibal room drink menu. The Tiki Wren, you can see Wren Clark had all of the glasses and barware custom made. Here's the Mai Tai, the Tiki Wren, the Virgin's Lament, the Widow Maker over here, and the Cannibal Bowl down here. Incredible. Spoken with several people who remember this and going to the Polynesian Village, saying how happy it made them. In August 1967, here is the Sunken Galleon, a Dilbeck rendering of the Sunken Galleon, depicting the ship on the ocean floor. In August 1967, Earl Moore of the E.M. Moore Investment Company, also formerly of the Double Seal Ring Company, assumed control of the hotel through a lease agreement. He immediately implemented a $250,000 remodeling, which was completed in February 1968. In October of 68, Moore sold the Western Hills to a group of 5 investors from Dallas. The hotel burned in a fire in September of 1969. prior to that, it had one of the highest occupancy rates of any hotel in the United States. Ren Clark was the star of the Western Hills all the way through, however, and he had a medallion minted in his honor shown here. That concludes the work in Fort Worth by Dilbeck. I have been working on a book on the architecture of Charles Stevens Dilbeck that will be published by Texas A&M University Press in 2023. I'd like to acknowledge all the various organizations and people that contributed to this PowerPoint and through the images and the photographers. And at this point, I'd like to conclude the presentation and turn the floor over back to Dr. Catherine Kate Holliday. Thank you.
Press that.
All right, welcome back. Thank you, Willis. I can't watch that enough. The photographs are incredible, and I really wish I was transported back in time to the tiki room and the Polynesian room, because that would have been quite remarkable. And maybe we'll hear from some people who were there. This is the point where we're going to try to turn it over to a few questions, and I'm going to try to look here and see what questions have been submitted. And I'm going to read them out loud to you, and you just chime in. Let's see. First question is, where was the unusual wood found? I'm guessing that probably the Pecky cypress. And do local lumber yards still sell these kinds of materials?
Dilbeck obviously had sources for his building materials. He was a kind of a specialist and a connoisseur of masonry, stone, brick, and wood that he used on the interior. And also I mentioned in the presentation the metal light fixtures and cast iron handrails and things like that. I don't know, unfortunately, where he found something like Pecky cypress wood. There are specialists, wood brokers in the state that sell specialty wood, and I would imagine that they can still acquire that today, but I'm sorry, I don't have names of any of those.
We have a question from Britt Stokes here that is, what's your personal favorite of the Dilbeck homes in Fort Worth?
It's not even possible to pick a favorite because there are so many great ones. As I may have mentioned earlier, outside of Tulsa and Dallas, no other city has more Dilbeck homes, residences, or projects than Fort Worth. And I think there's some really great ones here. The Meeker house is unique because of its size and its site, and the meandering character of the floor plan. It's also one of the very earliest of Dilbeck's great ranch work. So that's something I'll be exploring in my book, is this Dilbeck made a transformation, or maybe a metamorphosis is a better word, from his French Norman work, which was almost exclusively what he did in Tulsa, and then imported that to Dallas in his early work in the Park Cities. But then he started doing ranch houses about 1935, 1936. So Meeker would have been one of the very earliest ranch houses. But if you look at the house, like that last view I showed of the upstairs sleeping porch, it's French Norman. So there are elements, French Norman elements on his ranch houses, and I'll be exploring that in the book. But I also admire the house on Simondale for the Parkers, and the house on West Ridge for the Griffiths. Those were substantial French Norman works. And then I also like the later work, his mid-century. Dilbeck is not really known for his mid-century work, but I've discovered about a dozen mid-century houses in Dallas that are quite stunning. And I think the second Meeker house on Crestwood would fall into that category. So really all great houses in Fort Worth.
So a question that kind of follows up on some of the things you just brought up, and this is from Greg Abanyas. Hello, Greg. He says, great lecture. David Williams and Charles Dilbeck, compare and contrast. And for folks in the audience who don't know, David Williams is another great pioneer modernist Texas architect.
Great question, Greg. And that's worth an article someday. that probably can't be answered in more than 10 minutes. But Greg is referring to David Williams, who's one of the most important and seminal architects that ever practiced in Texas. He preceded Dilbeck slightly. His masterpiece was built in Dallas in 1932, the Elbert Williams residence. Dilbeck arrived in Dallas in 32, probably saw it because he built one of his ranch masterpieces next door to it, both on McFarland Boulevard and University Park. Dilbeck Williams is sometimes credited as being the originator of the ranch style, but I think Dilbeck called Williams' work city ranch. He called his work more country ranch, more informal. David Williams was also famous as the mentor of another great Texas architect named O'Neill Ford. They traveled to Central Texas and the Hill Country, cities like Castroville, Fredericksburg, Bernie, and other places to document the pioneer German houses that were built down there, brought the lessons learned, their photography and their sketches back to Dallas, and began working in developing a new style of architecture called indigenous Texas architecture, the indigenous house. So I think Williams houses are more fall under the indigenous label than a specific ranch label. And again, this conversation and discussion could go on a lot longer, and I'd love to continue that maybe sometime in the future.
And now this is a question from Nancy McCoy, who knows Dilbeck well, and she's wondering if you see any kind of comparison between the work that Dilbeck did in Dallas and in Fort Worth, and if the houses in Fort Worth were smaller than the ones that he did in Dallas.
They're actually very similar. The I.C. Parker House, for example, I mentioned that it was basically a duplicate of the house for Messerol Brothers, a speculative house built in University Park. Dilbeck was not above selling his floor plans to somebody to build an identical house. In this case, though, he made them run them through the blueprint machine upside down so that it wouldn't be an exact replica. I guess he didn't want his client in Dallas to know that he had sold the plans to a family in Fort Worth as a duplicate. The house on West Ridge for Russell Griffith is very similar to a house on Deloche Avenue in Dallas for Marshall Cloyd. I showed you the octagonal turret of the Griffith house and then faded in a photograph of an almost identical octagonal turret of the Marshall Cloyd house. So he used these, there were similar plans, there were similar compositional elements that Dilbeck reused time and again throughout his commissions and throughout his career. The Fort Worth houses stand up well against the Dallas houses. They're not necessarily smaller, but there are similarities. There are stylistic and architectural similarities between the houses in the two cities that are, you would see as something that are similar, but there's also totally unique.
Yeah, we have a lot of great questions here, and I really appreciate all of these coming in. And so I'm kind of picking some of the ones that are, because I don't want to go too long. But this is a great question from Michael Mullins. Are the Dilbeck houses in Texas, and more specifically in Fort Worth, sufficiently protected today?
That is a very important question. There isn't, I'm not aware of any protection necessarily. However, several owners in Dallas have listed their Dilbeck houses on the National Register. That's what protects it, is from demolition. Some have also listed with the Park Cities Historic and Preservation Society. I'm not sure how strong that protection is, but if you take the extraordinary step of putting it on the National Register, that's a serious protection. You can also protect houses through deed restrictions. If you sell the house and put a deed restriction on it from ever being demolished or significantly altered, that's another strong one. Generally, the houses that Dilbeck designed and built were of substantial enough size and of substantial and significant architectural character that many of them are still with us today. The exception would be in several areas of Dallas, particularly on Bryn Mawr Street, where there were originally 25 houses, and they're being torn down weekly right now. And that's very disturbing. In fact, I would nominate Dilbeck houses on Bryn Mawr for the 11 most endangered neighborhood list on any preservation list. It's tragic what's happening there. But on the other hand, on Milam Street, where there's 15 houses by Dilbeck designed for a developer named Sam Labello in the early 30s, they're all entirely there. None have been torn down because the neighbors, there's not as much economic pressure on Milam Street as there is on Bryn Mawr, and the neighbors truly recognize how important and significant these cottages are on Milam. So it really varies from city to city, but mainly it has to do with economic pressure and whether a house in the Park Cities, in particular on Bryn Mawr, can be sold for lot value and a huge profit.
Yeah, and Jerry, you may want to follow up on this too in terms of Fort Worth, but here in Fort Worth, probably the best possible way to protect a Dilbeck is by making it a local landmark.
That is correct. In Fort Worth, we have a really strong preservation ordinance. So writing a nomination to the City of Fort Worth's Landmarks Commission to consider your house for a landmark status is the best that you could do. You know, we love the National Register here, and we agree with you. And it's wonderful if it's a commercial property. There's some economic incentives that come with a National Register designation. But truly in Fort Worth, the best way to protect your house is to locally landmark it.
Kate, let me take this question from Deborah Reed.
Yeah.
She says, Deborah asks, it sounds as though he had no formal training, that he was self-taught. Were architects licensed in those days? If so, how did he pass muster? So the answer is there was no architectural licensing and registration until in Texas. I think it was in 1937. And I'm not sure when in Oklahoma. It is probably somewhere around the same time frame. But I mentioned that Dilbeck began work for John Duncan Forsyth on the Marlin Mansion in Ponca City while he was still a senior in high school. I have reason to believe that he may have dropped out of high school to take this job with John Duncan Forsyth. And that was a 3-year project from 25 to 28. In Dilbeck's oral history interviews, he says that he attended college for 2 years at Oklahoma A&M University, which is now Oklahoma State. They have no records that he enrolled there. And then he also claims to have taken graduate work at Tulsa University, but they do not even have an architecture program. So it's possible. I'm still looking and examining this and looking and researching it, but it's possible that Dilbeck did not have a college education. But he was obviously an incredibly talented, naturally talented architect. And he was in 1937 when architectural registration was required by the state boards in Texas and Oklahoma and other states. He submitted an application and was sort of grandfathered in with a state license in Texas.
Great. Do you want to take one more question before we wrap it up? One or two. We've got quite a few here. And what I'm going to suggest is maybe some of these questions that we don't get to, what we'll do is try to download them and get back in touch with you individually and follow up. Because there's quite a few good questions here. This question from Stan Tucker McDermott. Was Dilbeck influenced by the arts and crafts movement? I see some similarities. I think that's a really good topic.
Yeah. Dilbeck never talks about his influence. I have the impression he didn't do much travel in the 30s and 40s until he became more affluent. Then he began to travel. And I mentioned that he only, as far as I can tell, only owned that single volume called La Normandie. So he probably, there were magazines with articles on arts and crafts, architecture, that he could have been influenced by, certainly. And I agree that there are aspects of his work that would fall under the arts and crafts category. And I think that's something that I need to study and take a close look at as I'm preparing to write the book.
Okay, I said last question, but actually I want to follow up with one more. There's a couple here that deal with the hotel. And one is, does any of the Western Hills Hotel still exist? And related question, does the El Rancho Hotel in Gallup, New Mexico still exist?
The Western Hills unfortunately burned, had a fire in the mid to late 50s. It was, I think there were insurance claim issues with it. And the owners, this is after Ren Clark had sold it to someone else, closed the hotel for good, and then eventually demolished it. It's a very interesting story. They sold off pieces of the hotel, materials from inside, the furnishings. You can read advertisements in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram for several years where they were offering everything for sale. They also sold the guest cottages and moved them off site for a certain specified amount, a fixed amount. And Jerry, you had put me in contact with someone that was wondering if some houses directly behind the Western Hills site might be some of those guest houses. And I'm going to take a close look at that. That'd be very interesting. It makes sense that the houses that a developer might have bought those for pennies on the dollar and only had to move them, half a block to a new site and then reconfigured. So I'll be looking at that. That's I think very interesting thought. The El Rancho in Gallup, however, is completely intact. It's not exactly on the interstate freeway, and it's hard to compete with new hotels, but it's intact. It's got a beautiful lobby interior. The exterior is completely in place. All the rooms are named for movie stars. It's a very interesting story about the hotel. It was built by a Dallas guy named Rupert R.E. Griffith, who owned the largest movie theater chain in the Southwest. His brother was D.W. Griffith, one of the great Hollywood film directors of all time. The hotel was built in Gallup to provide lodging for movie stars for all the Westerns that were shot in Western New Mexico and Eastern Arizona. So all the movie stars in these Westerns stayed there. Griffith later went to Las Vegas with his nephew to look for furniture for the hotel, and ended up building, to make a long story short, the second hotel on the Las Vegas Strip outside of downtown Las Vegas in the early 40s called the Hotel Last Frontier. So there's a whole nother connection there with the movie industry and Dilbeck's influence. If you look at the Hotel Last Frontier in Las Vegas, it looks like a Dilbeck hotel. And Griffith's nephew that managed it and actually became the architect that designed it was heavily influenced by Dilbeck's work at the El Rancho. But I would encourage everyone, it's worth the trip to Gallup to stay at the El Rancho.
Well, thank you, Willis. I know there's still some more questions, and I'm kind of going through and collecting them so that we can follow up when in our leisure at another time. There is one question that I think is a good transition for handing it back over to Jerry, who I know has a few things she wants to say to wrap up. again, thank you, Willis. Like with the virtual clapping, we're all clapping wherever we are all around the world. This is fantastic, and a really interesting look at an incredibly creative architect. But the question I think may be a good kind of transition back to you, Jerry, is how could Historic Fort Worth perhaps work with the owners of houses to try to work on some protections?
Well, it's called education, 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 and communicating with owners who have great properties is very important for us to keep doing. And anyone else who cares about a particular house or a street or a neighborhood, a local historic district is even better than just individually landmarking your property, because you have the character of the streetscape as part of your property in a local historic district. We have a leading example here in Fort Worth and Fairmount for how valuable that type of a tool can be to an entire neighborhood. But if not that, then landmark your house. If you need help in writing a nomination, we can help some with that. And it's not rocket science. You can do the research. We can help you with those sources, and you too could landmark your house. So I would encourage that. I want to thank Willis for his wonderful presentation and his, I believe, 3 trips to Fort Worth. You now know the way, and I'm not sure we should let you back in Dallas. And Kate, he wouldn't be here without you. You were really the brainchild so for this evening, and we appreciate that connection also. And to everyone who's watching, thank you for doing that. And we invite you to continue to join with us on our many, many events and opportunities. You can join as a member. You can be an event participant, that from an art show and sell to a garden tour, to a rodeo run, to a needle art exhibit at Thistle Hill. You can be a tourist at one of the historic properties. You can be a digital friend, and as some who are passionate about buildings in Fort Worth, you can help us create and sustain our unique historic identity here. There's a learning curve in that. I doubt many of you learned about how to protect a neighborhood or how to protect your house when you were in high school or when you were in college. It's an important learning curve to grasp. You also have a chance to win a raffle ticket for a painting for a Fort Worth Circle artist by stopping in Carter Bowden's Antiques, and that's at Bryce Avenue and Camp Bowie Boulevard. We have 3 that have been underwritten paintings. 2 are Fort Worth Circle and 1 is by a teacher of Fort Worth Circle artists. And it would be terrific if you won one of those. You can actually have a chance to win by purchasing a $150 ticket, and that would be a bargain for a Fort Worth Circle painting. So we invite you to do that. Information on that opportunity is on our website and on other opportunities as well. So come again. We don't know where we'll be. We don't know if it'll be virtual or live, but we love the fact that you all made the time to learn more about Charles Dilbeck tonight.
Great, thank you, everyone. And that concludes the evening. A nice cold, rainy evening to be at home for a Zoom lecture. Thank you again, Willis, and we'll see you next time.